New York, 1930s. The city sweats beneath flickering neon, where smoke from speakeasies curls upward and mixes with the perfume of danger. It is a night stitched together by whispered deals and blood-soaked promises. Somewhere between the glittering advertisements and alleyway shadows, a name is moving like a silent storm, Lucky Luciano. Not yet a king, but no longer a pawn. The night is humid, restless, listening. Something irreversible is about to happen. Taxi tires hiss against wet pavement. In dim bars, men speak in low tones about a young gangster who thinks different from the old Sicilian dons. He wears American suits, speaks both English and Sicilian, and laughs in the face of tradition. No one agrees whether he is insane or brilliant. Everyone agrees he is dangerous. Through smoke-filled backrooms, an idea is forming, a plan that will turn chaos into order, will make a criminal into a statesman of the underworld. On this evening, the balance of power begins to tilt. No gunshots yet. No bodies. Just a subtle shift, like the quiet before an earthquake. The air hums with music, jazz rhythms, trumpets screaming into the dawn of a new era. Still, beneath the glitz and nightlife lies a darker pulse. Neighborhoods carved by ethnicity battle for territory. Italians, Jews, Irish, each controls their streets, each protects their corner with bloody intensity. Prohibition has made fortunes, it has also made corpses. In this volatile world, Luciano walks with confidence bordering on arrogance. The scars on his cheeks, marks of youthful punishment, glitter beneath lamplight. They call him lucky for surviving the kind of violence that kills most men. But those who know him whisper a different explanation: he makes his own luck. On this night, he isn't just playing the game. He is rewriting it. He steps into a private club where the walls themselves seem to absorb secrets. Men stand when he enters, though he is not yet their boss. They see something in his eyes, cold intelligence, the ability to calculate loyalty and betrayal in the same breath. His future allies and future enemies are all here, though none realize they are witnessing the beginning of a new world. The city feels on edge. The police take bribes. Politicians dine with criminals. The law bends like a blade in a skilled hand. But beneath this chaos is the unspoken truth: nobody is truly in charge. Old bosses cling to their fading power, demanding fealty to ancient codes rather than adapting to the new American landscape. They expect obedience. They receive quiet rebellion. Luciano has tired of the old ways, the rigid traditions, the pointless vendettas, the arrogant dons who refuse to think beyond Sicily. He sees America for what it is, an opportunity. Not just for violence, but for business. If crime is inevitable, he believes, it should be organized. Structured. Efficient. Tonight is not about street fights or drunken threats. It is about vision. He speaks in calm tones, the words flowing like smoke around the room. He talks of alliances across ethnic lines, ideas considered blasphemy by older mobsters. He talks of profit without ego, power without chaos. Some scoff, others lean forward with quiet hunger. The first seeds are planted. Outside, rain begins to fall. It drums against the windows like impatient fingers. The world is changing whether anyone likes it or not. And Luciano, with cigarette smoke framing his expression, seems to understand that change better than anyone alive. He leaves the club after hours of strategy and persuasion. The streets are quieter now, slick with rain. Street lamps glow like watchful eyes. A car follows him in silence, not a threat, but a shadow. His men always watch, always protect. None would dare strike at him now, not because he is invincible, but because they know his revenge would be the stuff of nightmares. The cabaret lights flicker as he passes. Couples dance inside, unaware that the rules of power are shifting outside their doors. The night feels pregnant with something sharp and new. Luciano pauses beneath an awning, staring across the city as if measuring every block, every neighborhood, every man. He imagines a world with structure instead of chaos. A world where families work together, not against each other. A commission, like a board of directors, where disputes are solved through strategy rather than bloodshed. Crime as system. Murder as business. Politics as partnership. He does not see boundaries, he sees opportunities. The rain stops. A thin fog rises from the pavement. Luciano lights another cigarette. He inhales deeply, as if breathing in the future he plans to claim. His eyes reflect nothing of doubt, only certainty. Tonight, something within him becomes unshakable. He understands who he must become, not merely feared, but untouchable. In the stillness of early morning, the city seems to bow. He walks on, disappearing into the mist, leaving only the faint scent of smoke and ambition. The path ahead will be lined with betrayal, blood, and brilliance. But in this moment, before history has written his name, one truth is clear: the criminal world is about to crown a new kind of king, one who leads not with honor, but with vision. This is the night Luciano stops chasing power, and begins owning it. The America that would one day kneel beneath Lucky Luciano's command was not a single empire, it was a fractured battlefield. In the early decades of the 20th century, crime in New York resembled a constantly shifting storm, with power divided not by strategy, but by ancestry, brutality, and fleeting alliances. Each gang functioned like a tiny kingdom, ruled by violence and guarded by paranoia. No unified direction, no central authority, only scattered warlords hungry for turf. Immigrant ghettos pulsed with desperation. The Italians huddled in Mulberry Street, the Irish patrolled Hell's Kitchen, the Jews held strong in the Lower East Side. Crime rose not from wickedness, but from necessity. When the law offered no protection, men created their own. They stole, smuggled, and killed to survive. Young boys learned early that the police protected the wealthy, not the poor. In this world, a quick fist and a quicker mind were worth more than a school education. The Italian underworld, though numerous, was itself divided. The Sicilians brought old feuds across the Atlantic, vendettas from tiny villages halfway across the world still raged on the crowded streets of Manhattan. Bosses were chosen not by cleverness, but by tradition and age. The mustache Petes, men who clung to the ways of the old country, demanded loyalty to their bloodlines and traditions. Their world was narrow, defined by Sicilian honor, silence, and disdain for anyone who wasn't born on their island. They mistrusted American ideas, believing business should be small, local, and secret, but the New World didn't follow Sicilian rules. America was louder, faster, more ambitious. Gambling, prostitution, extortion, and smuggling could make fortunes far larger than anything imaginable back home. Yet the old bosses failed to adapt. Their battles were personal, emotional, and full of ego. Every insult demanded blood, every disagreement a killing. The streets ran red not because money required it, but because pride demanded it. Then came Prohibition, America's grand experiment in morality. The government outlawed alcohol, and in doing so, accidentally minted an army of bootleg millionaires. Overnight, the underworld transformed from petty thieves into industrial giants. Smuggling routes stretched from Canada to Cuba. Barrels of whiskey moved through hidden tunnels, bribed ports, and backroom deals. And yet, even with this river of money, the criminal world remained divided. Every gang wanted a piece. Every shipment was contested. Raids turned into shootouts, business meetings into executions. The Irish had their own structure, tough, organized, and fiercely loyal. The Jews embraced innovation, building networks of suppliers and informants. The Italians, though powerful, were splintered by tradition and internal politics. Only a few visionaries sensed what could be created if these worlds were merged. But most were busy fighting battles that never ended. Violence was not a tool, it was a language. Restaurants exploded without warning. Bodies appeared in gutters, their mouths stuffed with olives or paper, a message only certain men could decode. The police, underpaid and overwhelmed, were easy to buy. Politicians gave speeches about law and morality by day, then dined with gang bosses at night. Law was not iron, law was clay. In this chaos, the Mafia lacked shape. Each boss acted like a king without a kingdom. They guarded their small territories with stubborn pride, refusing partnerships, preferring blood over profit. The idea that an Irishman or a Jew could be an ally was unthinkable to the old dons. To them, business was only meant for Sicilians. Everyone else was a necessary nuisance. But the younger generation saw things differently. They grew up in America, understanding its pulse. They spoke English, read newspapers, and saw the advantage of blending cultures. They believed money didn't care about ethnicity, only opportunity. These young men mingled in streets and schools, forming friendships across backgrounds, friendships that would one day reshape the underworld. At the time, though, the old ways still dominated. The Sicilians enforced omerta, the code of silence, with ferocious devotion. Betrayal meant death, slow, painful, instructional. The families were bound by rituals, by blood oaths whispered in candlelight. Their leaders sat in smoky basement rooms, speaking in Sicilian dialects, as if America itself didn't exist. Extortion was the backbone of power. Shops and restaurants paid tribute to stay safe. If they refused, windows shattered, and sons disappeared. Union halls were battlegrounds where bribes were exchanged like sacred currency. Money flowed, but without direction or larger purpose. Everyone fought for themselves. This was the world Luciano observed. He saw turf wars that accomplished nothing. He watched men die because of grudges older than the Statue of Liberty. He saw fortunes evaporate because the bosses refused to work together. He realized that the underworld was like 1,000 engines roaring in different directions, no coordination, no central leadership. It was a giant wasting its own strength. The old generation believed power came from fear alone. Luciano believed power came from order. At this moment in history, the Mafia could have been wiped out by law enforcement, too chaotic, too visible. But the government was disorganized, the public divided, and the criminals too occupied killing each other to notice. New York was a stage without a single performer commanding the spotlight. The city was waiting for someone with the courage to break tradition, to think beyond bloodlines and vendettas. Someone who could look beyond vengeance and see opportunity. It was a perfect storm, a divided underworld. A wealthy black market. A government unsure how to enforce new laws. A nation drowning in alcohol and hypocrisy. Into this storm would step a man who understood both worlds, the immigrant and the American, the killer and the businessman. A man who would unite what no one else could. The world before Lucky Luciano was a battlefield with no general. Soon, it would become an empire. He was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897, in the small Sicilian town of Lercara Fritti, where life was harsh and the future offered little more than hunger and superstition. His father worked long hours in sulfur mines, his mother prayed for protection, and young Salvatore learned early that survival required more than faith. The streets were dusty, poor, and unforgiving. Families clung to tradition, and boys were expected to honor silence, respect, and toughness. These were the foundations that would follow him halfway across the world. In 1906, the Lucania family boarded a ship to America, carrying only a few liras and an ocean of hope. Ellis Island was a storm of languages, fear, and anticipation. The family settled on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a dense neighborhood packed with immigrants, disease, and the scent of sweat and bread. There, childhood ended quickly. Dreams were crushed by factory smoke. Little boys became men not through age, but through necessity. Young Salvatore learned English from the streets, not schools. Classrooms felt distant, irrelevant. What mattered was strength, physical, mental, emotional. Anyone who appeared weak became prey. He watched as children were beaten for their accents, mocked for their clothes, and robbed on their way home. To protect himself, he joined small groups of kids who roamed the alleyways. They shared cigarettes, stole fruit, and learned to fight with whatever they had, fists, knives, stones. In this crucible, he developed confidence. Fearlessness became his armor. He began extorting other immigrant kids for pennies. If they paid, he protected them. If they didn't, he taught them a painful lesson. Even at a young age, he understood leverage, how fear could make a boy stronger than his size suggested. He learned to control not just with fists, but with the threat of fists. Violence was a tool, not a hobby. By his early teens, he was no longer Salvatore. The streets called him Lucky, a nickname born from a blend of myth and reality. Some said he won money gambling. Others said he survived beatings that should have killed him. He brushed off these stories with a grin, but the truth was clear: he was hard to kill, harder to control. He met Meyer Lansky as a teenager, a relationship that would change history. Meyer was sharp, calm, analytical. Where the Italian gangs ruled with emotion, Meyer brought logic. The two boys recognized something familiar in each other: ambition. Neither wanted to spend life working dead-end jobs or begging for scraps. They wanted power, not just money. Their friendship was built on respect, not heritage, a rare bond in a world obsessed with ethnicity. Lucky also crossed paths with Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, a firestorm wrapped in human skin. Bugsy was unpredictable, fearless, deadly, a man whose violence was almost artistic. Together with Lansky, Lucky formed a trio that blended brains, brutality, and charm. They robbed, smuggled, and ran small crews. Each job sharpened their skills and deepened their reputations. Lucky's rise wasn't clean or romantic. He was arrested multiple times, beaten regularly, and nearly killed more than once. At 18, he was kidnapped, stabbed repeatedly, and left for dead under the Williamsburg Bridge. The scars carved into his face became his silent introduction. People stared, but Lucky wore them like medals. Those who heard about the attack whispered that he survived because he was protected by fate, Lucky beyond reason. He never revealed who ordered the hit, nor did he seek revenge publicly. He respected the code, even when it tried to bury him. These scars hardened him. They became a message to the world: he would not fall easily. His survival changed him not just physically, but psychologically. He began to think bigger. Life wasn't just about survival, it was about dominance. He had been given a second chance, he would use it to build something greater than any gang before him. He entered the world of bootlegging during Prohibition, building networks instead of fighting for scraps. He formed connections with suppliers, politicians, cops, anyone who could help him move liquor and make money. He understood that relationships were as powerful as guns. His charm disarmed enemies, his intelligence impressed businessmen. He was more American than Sicilian now, forward-thinking, ambitious, and unafraid of change. The mustache Pete's noticed him. They liked his loyalty, his ability to make money, and his willingness to do what others couldn't. He became a trusted enforcer and negotiator, moving between families, smoothing conflicts, and earning more than most men twice his age. But he also saw their flaws, their obsession with heritage, their hatred of innovation. He knew he could never be content serving men who lived in the past. As his influence grew, he observed the underworld with calculating eyes. The violence was chaotic, the profits scattered, the leaders stubborn and small-minded. He imagined a future where crime operated like a business, with organization, rules, and shared power. He believed that alliances should be built on profit, not ethnicity. To him, a Jewish partner was better than a useless Sicilian relative. The old bosses saw beneath his polite smile a dangerous mind, one that questioned their authority. For Lucky, power wasn't about tradition. It was about results. His personal life was just as complex. He lived fast, drinking, gambling, chasing women, but always with a sense of intention. He was never reckless without reason. His nights were filled with smoke-filled clubs and whispered deals. Every interaction was a potential alliance, every stranger a potential tool. He listened more than he talked, learning everything about everyone. Despite his youth, he carried himself like a man who already owned the future. By his mid-20s, Lucky Luciano was no longer a street kid hustling for coins. He was a rising strategist with connections stretching across New York. He could order violence with a nod, negotiate with businessmen in daylight, and disappear into the night without trace. His friends were the most dangerous men in America. His enemies respected him even as they plotted against him. Inside his mind, the vision was forming, a unified underworld, efficient and profitable. But before he could become the architect of modern organized crime, he first had to survive the old world's final test. And for that, he needed patience, alliances, and a willingness to betray everything he once thought sacred. The rise of Salvatore Lucania was complete. The era of Lucky Luciano was about to begin. He had climbed from the gutters of the Lower East Side and now stood on the threshold of something far greater. But power, real power, required more than muscle or quick thinking. It required structure, something the criminal world had never fully understood. To Lucky Luciano, the Mafia was not meant to be a chaotic patchwork of feuding families, it could be an empire. It only needed someone bold enough to build it. By the late 1920s, Luciano had outgrown petty rackets. Bootlegging had turned into an industrial operation, and he envisioned a network where every shipment, bribe, and handshake was coordinated. He understood supply chains before the term existed: rum runners from Canada, whiskey from Scotland, rum from the Caribbean. He made deals with criminals in Cuba, with businessmen who pretended not to notice the crates of liquor coming in under nightfall. Each transaction refined his understanding of scale. The first step in building his empire was human structure. He chose men not for ethnicity, but for competence. He regarded outdated Sicilian loyalties with contempt. What mattered was skill, not birthplace. Meyer Lansky became his consigliere in all but name, his strategist outside the Sicilian hierarchy. Bugsy Siegel provided force, the kind of violence that kept rivals awake at night. Frank Costello became his political diplomat, the man who could walk into any mayor's office, union hall, or police headquarters and leave with a new ally. This inner circle was unlike anything the Mafia had seen. It blended cultures, temperaments, and talents. Luciano had effectively built a board of directors, men who understood money, politics, and power. They were bound not by blood, but by vision. But alliances alone were not enough. To build a true empire, the old guard had to fall. The Mustache Petes, Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, ruled the Italian underworld like medieval warlords. Their feud, the Castellamarese War, had drenched New York in blood. They refused to cooperate across backgrounds, refusing opportunities in favor of ancient codes. Luciano pretended loyalty to both, playing the middle with perfect subtlety. He was their golden enforcer, the rising star who seemed to bend under their authority. In reality, he was silently planning to replace them. Luciano understood that power often required betrayal. He chose his moment carefully. Masuria went first. On a quiet afternoon in 1931, Luciano took his boss to a restaurant in Coney Island. They ate, chatted, gambled. Then, Luciano excused himself to the bathroom. When he returned, the table was painted red. Masuria lay dead, riddled with bullets. The killers were Lansky's men. Luciano's hands remained clean. The newspapers called it another gang hit, the underworld knew it was the first stroke of a new kingdom. But removing Masuria only solved half the problem. Maranzano still loomed. The so-called boss of bosses crowned himself supreme leader after Masuria's death, attempting to force Luciano into submission. But Maranzano was a relic, rigid, distrustful, obsessed with old-world customs. He saw Luciano's modern vision as a threat. Luciano saw Maranzano as an obstacle to history. Within months, Luciano moved again. Posing as FBI agents, four Jewish gunmen entered Maranzano's office and brutally ended his reign. No Sicilian fingerprints. No code violation to trace. In one swift move, the last mustache Pete fell, and the underworld fell silent, stunned by Luciano's precision. No war followed, everyone knew resistance was futile. With the old bosses gone, Luciano could begin building the future. He organized the Italian Mafia into families, each with defined territories and leaders. No single boss ruled them all, instead, they were equals. To settle disputes and avoid bloodshed, he created a governing body, the Commission. This was the heart of his design. Like a corporate board, it consisted of representation from each family. All major decisions required consensus. Murder became a strategic choice, not an emotional impulse. Under this system, crime became stable. Profits soared. Luciano told his men there was more money in cooperation than in vendettas. Business came first, ego came last. His empire extended beyond Italian families. He welcomed Jewish and Irish syndicates into partnerships. This was revolutionary, the Mafia had never tolerated outsiders. Luciano saw that Meyer Lansky's contacts were as valuable as any Sicilian capo. He believed power was about networks, not exclusion. Together, they created a multi-ethnic criminal enterprise that ran like Wall Street. They invested profits into legitimate businesses, laundromats, trucking companies, construction firms, to launder money and expand their reach. Unions became weapons. Through Costello's connections, they controlled ports, factories, and construction sites. Every crate that entered New York Harbor paid a silent tax to the underworld. Every building that rose in Manhattan owed a piece of its foundation to Luciano. He built a payroll list that read like a political registry: judges, mayors, police captains, union bosses. Each was a chess piece, ready to move when called. If influence failed, violence stepped in. But Luciano always preferred persuasion over bullets. The dead don't pay. His organization stretched across the nation. Chicago, Cleveland, New Orleans, Los Angeles, families coordinated their rackets, sharing profits and territories. Las Vegas was still a dusty town, but Luciano saw its future. He helped Bugsy Siegel secure gambling interests, planting seeds that would one day become a desert empire. Prostitution, gambling, narcotics, extortion, every illegal dollar passed through his system. He didn't need to physically touch the money. The structure he designed made him rich without exposure. He was the architect, the silent shareholder. But Luigi understood the psychology behind power. He didn't rule through fear alone. He rewarded loyalty with wealth, autonomy, and opportunity. Men followed him not because they were afraid, but because he delivered results. He never embarrassed subordinates, he never acted impulsively. That steadiness made him appear invulnerable. His persona only added to his mystique. He dressed impeccably, tailored suits, polished shoes, silk ties. He moved through nightclubs and private lounges with calm confidence, surrounded by politicians, actresses, and gangsters. He dated showgirls and spoke like a businessman. To many, he did not seem like a criminal at all, but a charming gentleman. Yet beneath that calm exterior lived an unbreakable strategist. When disagreements arose among families, he mediated. When tensions flared, he found compromise. He believed that stability meant longevity, and longevity meant wealth. He rarely raised his voice, but when he did, men listened. In only a few years, Luciano transformed a fragmented Italian underworld into a unified national syndicate. He replaced vendetta with strategy, chaos with structure, tradition with innovation. The Commission stood as his greatest invention, a machine that would keep organized crime alive for decades after his death. He had not simply built an empire. He had built something more enduring, a system. A system that made him the most powerful criminal mind in American history. Omerta was more than a rule, it was a way of life, a philosophy etched into the very bones of the Mafia. It demanded silence, loyalty, and absolute obedience. To break it was to invite death, to embrace it was to gain protection, status, and power. For Lucky Luciano, omerta was both a weapon and a tool, a psychological framework that allowed him to manipulate, control, and ultimately revolutionize organized crime. It was the invisible thread that bound men together, even as betrayal lurked in the shadows. From the moment a boy joined a crew, he learned the consequences of breaking the code. Words carried weight, secrets were currency. Speak too freely to outsiders, and the streets would answer with violence. It was a lesson in fear, but also in discipline. Loyalty was not optional, it was the lifeline that separated survival from death. For Luciano, this understanding became the cornerstone of his power. He knew that fear alone could not create order, it had to be balanced with calculated respect, reward, and subtle psychological manipulation. Omerta demanded constant vigilance. Men were watched not only for disloyalty, but also for signs of ambition that could threaten the hierarchy. Every word spoken, every gesture made, was scrutinized. Luciano understood this instinctively. He recognized that human nature craved recognition and power. By granting small privileges to loyal lieutenants and punishing betrayal swiftly, he created a psychological equilibrium. Men became invested in their own silence, in protecting the secrets of the organization, because their survival and advancement depended on it. At the same time, omerta offered Luciano a paradoxical freedom. While the code restricted personal expression, it allowed him to operate above traditional scrutiny. He could maneuver through rival families, make alliances across ethnic lines, and execute hits with surgical precision, all under the shield of an unspoken code. Others feared speaking out of turn. Luciano capitalized on this fear, bending their loyalty without ever appearing overtly threatening. The code became his silent army, invisible yet omnipresent. The psychological implications of omerta were profound. Fear and loyalty intertwined to create a hierarchy where obedience was internalized rather than enforced solely by force. A man would think twice before betraying the organization because he knew that everyone else was watching, waiting, judging. The consequences were not just physical, they were social, reputational, and existential. A defector did not merely die, he was erased from memory, a cautionary tale whispered in alleys and bars. Luciano mastered this system, understanding that controlling perception was as critical as controlling action. Luciano also manipulated omerta to his advantage when planning his rise. He allowed certain betrayals to occur quietly, permitting his enemies to underestimate him. By appearing loyal to Masuria and Maranzano while secretly plotting their demise, he created a controlled chaos. The code of silence insulated his actions from scrutiny, allowing him to operate with near-perfect discretion. Men who might have opposed him either respected the code too much to act or trusted him too much to question him. But omerta was more than fear, it was also about honor and reciprocity. Luciano recognized that men were not motivated by terror alone. Loyalty needed reinforcement. He rewarded those who followed the rules with money, protection, and influence. Subordinates who demonstrated discretion and intelligence rose quickly within the organization. In this way, omerta became a system of incentives as much as a system of deterrence, a psychological balance that strengthened his control. This code also shaped his understanding of betrayal. Luciano knew that no man could be trusted entirely, yet every man could be guided. He built redundancy into his alliances, ensuring that even if one lieutenant faltered, others could maintain operations. By cultivating loyalty through both fear and reward, he created a resilient organization that could withstand shocks, murders, arrests, or rival attacks, without collapsing. The influence of omerta extended beyond the Mafia itself. Luciano leveraged it in negotiations with politicians, police, and businessmen. While outsiders were not bound by the code, they often respected its rules implicitly, recognizing the deadly consequences of interference. It allowed him to operate in a world where legality and morality were inconsistent, where trust was scarce, and where secrecy was the most valuable currency. In practice, omerta also required ritual. Initiations, secret handshakes, and oaths reinforced psychological bonds. The symbolism reminded men that they were part of something greater than themselves, a lineage of tradition and consequence. This connection between fear, loyalty, and identity strengthened the organization's cohesion. Luciano understood that men would protect their place within this hierarchy not merely for money, but to preserve their very sense of self. Luciano's genius was in interpreting omerta as a flexible instrument rather than a rigid code. He respected its power enough to enforce it, but understood its limits well enough to bend it when strategy demanded. In the assassinations of Masuria and Maranzano, he exploited the code's expectations, appearing loyal while secretly orchestrating their demise. The code protected him, even as it allowed him to break it without detection. Through omerta, Luciano did more than survive, he dominated. The psychological mastery of fear, loyalty, and silence became as important to his empire as the guns and money that filled his pockets. He created an environment where men acted predictably, yet believed they acted freely. In this world, he was not merely a participant, he was the architect of human behavior. Omerta was the invisible scaffolding of his empire. It shaped men, dictated actions, and preserved secrets. By mastering it, Luciano transformed the Mafia from a chaotic collection of feuding gangs into a disciplined, profit-driven organization. He weaponized the human mind itself, understanding that control over loyalty and silence was as lethal as any bullet. In the end, omerta was not just a code, it was a mirror. It reflected the duality of man, capable of loyalty and treachery, fear and courage, obedience and rebellion. And in that reflection, Luciano saw himself as both student and master, the man who would bend tradition to his will and create a criminal empire built on the subtle power of silence. Luciano understood early on that crime could be more than survival, it could be industry. The streets had taught him how to fight, how to intimidate, and how to survive, but those skills alone could not build the kind of empire he envisioned. To him, every illegal operation was a business, every shipment of liquor or contraband a potential profit center, every alliance a strategic investment. Unlike the chaotic thuggery of his predecessors, Luciano approached crime like a CEO approaching a corporation, with calculation, structure, and a relentless focus on efficiency. Bootlegging had been his entry point. Prohibition created a massive, unregulated market. Bars, speakeasies, and nightclubs were thirsty for liquor, and anyone who could supply it would earn unimaginable profits. Luciano did not merely smuggle whiskey, he organized the logistics of supply and distribution. Rum shipments from Canada, whiskey from Scotland, rum from the Caribbean, all moved under carefully monitored channels. Payments were collected, debts recorded, and routes protected. Violence was a tool, not the foundation. Gunfire was only deployed when negotiations failed, which in a well-managed system, was rare. Prostitution became another cornerstone of his enterprise. Rather than running it haphazardly, Luciano implemented strict oversight. He established networks of brothels, monitored by trusted lieutenants who reported directly to him. Payments were systematically collected, and protection was offered to both clients and operators in exchange for loyalty. By standardizing the operations, he increased profits while reducing risk. Disorder was replaced with predictability, and predictability translated into long-term gains. Gambling, too, was meticulously managed. Luciano created controlled environments where bets could be placed securely, the odds subtly manipulated, and profits guaranteed. He brought in accountants and strategists, men who understood numbers, to track cash flows. The randomness of chance was harnessed, luck could be marketed, but losses were minimized through careful management. Even in the densest, smoke-filled gambling rooms, he maintained oversight, ensuring that no employee could cheat the house without consequences. Labor unions offered yet another avenue for influence and income. Luciano understood that control over labor could be just as profitable as control over crime. Through alliances with union leaders and strategic bribery, he gained influence over shipping docks, construction sites, and warehouses. This allowed him to dictate who could work where, controlling supply lines and inflating profits. He did not merely extort, he integrated, transforming unions from potential threats into vital components of his system. Luciano's operations were interconnected. Money from gambling could fund bootlegging, proceeds from prostitution could lubricate union deals, and every success reinforced loyalty. His empire was not a series of separate criminal acts, it was a network, a living organism of revenue streams, all feeding into a central brain, Luciano himself. He delegated, but always retained oversight. He understood the balance between autonomy and accountability, letting trusted lieutenants run daily operations while keeping ultimate control. One of his greatest innovations was diversification. Luciano did not rely on a single revenue stream, he spread risk across multiple enterprises. If one venture faced law enforcement pressure, others could sustain the empire. He also understood the value of reinvestment. Profits were cycled back into new ventures, ensuring continual expansion. Over time, the organization became almost impervious to disruption, capable of absorbing shocks that would have crippled smaller operations. Narcotics, though riskier, eventually became part of his portfolio. He approached it cautiously, aware of the legal and moral minefield. Operations were compartmentalized, insulated from the rest of the empire, and overseen by only the most trusted associates. Control and secrecy were paramount. This prudence allowed him to profit from illicit trade without exposing the entire system to unnecessary risk. Perhaps most importantly, Luciano recognized that the human element was as critical as logistics. Employees, lieutenants, and partners were motivated by incentives, not just fear. He rewarded loyalty with money, autonomy, and prestige. Conversely, betrayal was met swiftly and decisively, reinforcing the psychological structure of obedience. Men followed him because they believed in the efficiency and inevitability of his system, not just because of intimidation. Political corruption was another integral component. Luciano bribed police officers, judges, and city officials, creating a protective layer around his operations. This allowed him to operate openly in ways that would have destroyed a less organized gang. He transformed risk into predictability, converting the chaos of criminal enterprise into a controlled, profitable industry. By combining logistics, human psychology, political influence, and ruthless efficiency, Luciano turned crime into a corporate enterprise. Every operation, from gambling dens to bootlegging rings, from union manipulation to narcotics networks, functioned like a subsidiary in a vast criminal conglomerate. He no longer needed to oversee every detail personally, the system was self-reinforcing, scalable, and sustainable. In this way, Lucky Luciano redefined what it meant to be a gangster. He was no longer simply a street fighter or enforcer. He was a visionary industrialist of crime, building a machine that generated wealth, commanded loyalty, and projected power far beyond his personal presence. Every shipment delivered, every bet placed, every union manipulated was a testament to his brilliance. Crime had been transformed from chaos into an enterprise, and at its helm was a man whose mind operated with precision, foresight, and ambition unmatched in the history of organized crime. Luciano had created a new blueprint, one where efficiency, structure, and psychology replaced mere violence. He had elevated crime from a collection of thugs into an empire. And in doing so, he had set the stage for a revolution that would change the underworld forever. The underworld was a chessboard, and Lucky Luciano was learning to see the entire board at once. Allies and enemies were never static, they shifted like shadows at dusk, forming alliances and rivalries that could change overnight. In this world, friendship was a commodity, loyalty a currency, and betrayal an ever-present threat. Luciano understood this better than anyone. He cultivated relationships with some of the most dangerous men in America, blending trust and manipulation, charm and intimidation, in a delicate balance that would allow him to survive, and ultimately thrive. The first and most important relationships were with his core allies. Meyer Lansky, with his sharp intellect and calm demeanor, became more than a partner, he was a strategist. Lansky could calculate risk and foresee consequences that others overlooked, a skill that complemented Luciano's own vision. Bugsy Siegel, on the other hand, was chaos incarnate, bold, unpredictable, and fiercely loyal. Where Lansky provided the cool calculation, Siegel provided the muscle and the willingness to act without hesitation. Together, they created a dynamic triad, blending brains, brutality, and ambition in ways that intimidated friend and foe alike. Frank Costello was another crucial ally, serving as a political bridge between the criminal underworld and the legitimate world. He could navigate City Hall, union offices, and police departments with ease, turning influence into profit. Costello's presence allowed Luciano to expand operations with a safety net of protection from law enforcement and politicians who might otherwise disrupt his plans. With Lansky, Siegel, and Costello, Luciano had built an inner circle capable of executing strategies that far exceeded the capabilities of any single gangster of the previous generation. But the world was not solely composed of allies. Rivals lurked in every shadow, and survival depended on understanding them as well as one understood oneself. Joe Masuria, the reigning Mustache Pete, commanded respect through fear and brutality. Maranzano, his successor, wielded authority through tradition and intimidation, his obsession with old Sicilian codes making him both predictable and dangerous. Luciano had to navigate the ambitions of these men carefully, balancing outward loyalty with private scheming. Misstep, and he would be dead. Precision, patience, and psychological insight were his shields. The art of alliance was as important as the art of betrayal. Luciano did not merely make friends, he forged partnerships with intent. He understood the value of integrating Jewish and Irish gangs into his network, creating bonds across ethnic and territorial lines. These alliances were not sentimental, they were strategic. They allowed him to extend his reach, stabilize operations, and prevent the kind of internecine conflict that had plagued the Mafia for decades. Cooperation became a form of self-preservation, and Luciano was the architect of this new reality. Betrayal was always a possibility, and Luciano treated it as an inevitable variable in the equation of power. He observed human behavior with the scrutiny of a surgeon, noting ambition, impatience, and pride in the men around him. He tolerated minor disloyalties when it served a greater purpose but struck ruthlessly when necessary. Loyalty, in his world, was conditional, measured not by words but by actions. Those who crossed him quickly learned the cost of miscalculation. Fear, however, was not enough on its own. Loyalty had to be cultivated, rewarded, and strategically reinforced to create an enduring hierarchy of obedience. Rivalries extended beyond personal grudges into territorial disputes and economic competition. Control over neighborhoods, docks, and illegal markets was contested fiercely. Luciano, however, applied the principle of calculated diplomacy. He mediated conflicts when advantageous, eliminated threats when unavoidable, and constantly sought to convert enemies into allies, or neutralize them quietly. His ability to navigate these dynamics was unprecedented. He saw potential allies where others saw only enemies and opportunities where others saw only danger. The Castellamarese War was the ultimate test of these skills. 2 generations of Italian crime bosses were at open war, and Luciano's position was perilous. He presented the appearance of neutrality while secretly negotiating with both sides, orchestrating strikes, and preparing the moment when the old guard would fall. The murders of Masuria and Maranzano were not impulsive acts, they were the culmination of meticulous planning, psychological insight, and strategic patience. Every relationship he cultivated, every alliance he nurtured, played a role in this masterful maneuvering. Even as he expanded his network, Luciano understood the limits of trust. Allies could become enemies overnight, and enemies could be converted if approached correctly. He constantly monitored relationships, gauging sentiment, detecting subtle shifts in loyalty, and anticipating moves before they were made. This psychological acuity allowed him to maintain stability within a volatile environment, where alliances were fragile and betrayal was commonplace. His ability to blend diplomacy with intimidation created a culture of cautious respect. Men followed him not simply out of fear, but because they recognized his skill and vision. They understood that loyalty to Luciano could yield wealth, protection, and opportunity that no other leader could offer. Simultaneously, they recognized that defiance carried catastrophic consequences. This balance of incentive and deterrent became the cornerstone of his influence, extending his reach far beyond what mere force could achieve. In the underworld, perception was as critical as reality. Luciano managed both expertly. He cultivated an image of calm, controlled authority, masking the deadly decisiveness that lay beneath. Allies were drawn to him, rivals wary. Men calculated their actions based on the knowledge that Luciano was always observing, always weighing, always planning. In this climate of uncertainty, he became both a unifying force and a figure of silent terror. Through these alliances and rivalries, Luciano was constructing more than a criminal network, he was building a new social order. The old rules of ethnicity, tradition, and ego were being replaced with a meritocratic system, where competence, loyalty, and strategic insight determined status. Power became a function of calculation rather than lineage. And at the center of this evolving ecosystem was Lucky Luciano, orchestrating relationships with the precision of a master strategist, ensuring that every ally strengthened him, every rival weakened him, and every move advanced the vision of an organized, unified underworld. In this world of shifting loyalties and hidden threats, Luciano learned the most critical lesson of all: to survive, and to thrive, one must be both charming and ruthless, patient and decisive, generous and terrifying. Every ally was an asset, every enemy a potential tool, and every relationship a part of a grand design that would ultimately secure his place as the undisputed architect of modern organized crime. The hidden war that raged beneath the surface of New York streets was invisible to most outsiders, yet it defined every transaction, every alliance, and every decision Lucky Luciano made. While the public saw speakeasies, clubs, and nightclubs thriving in the roaring 1920s and 1930s, the underworld was engaged in a battle that was not about money alone, it was about survival, supremacy, and the reshaping of an entire criminal ecosystem. This war was fought quietly, strategically, and with a precision that few could recognize until it was too late. The Castellamarese War had set the stage. Two factions of Italian crime families, divided by tradition, ego, and Sicilian heritage, had plunged the city into a bloody stalemate. Hundreds died in gunfights, ambushes, and carefully orchestrated hits. Luciano had initially appeared to be a loyal enforcer within this chaos, yet beneath the surface, he was orchestrating a plan that would change the balance of power forever. The war was a test, not merely of strength, but of intellect, patience, and psychological mastery. He had to navigate a landscape filled with men ready to die to uphold the honor of their ancestors, men whose loyalty was bound by fear and tradition. Luciano's survival during this war required meticulous strategy. He cultivated relationships across rival factions, offering temporary alliances while secretly preparing their downfall. Trust was a currency he spent sparingly. Every conversation, every handshake, every favor was measured against the potential risk or advantage it provided. He had to anticipate betrayal, understand motivations, and manipulate perceptions, all while maintaining the facade of loyalty. In this hidden war, appearances were as lethal as bullets, and missteps could be fatal. Law enforcement added another layer to the conflict. Police officers, often corrupt and easily bought, could be as dangerous as any rival if they acted unpredictably. Federal agents, emboldened by prohibition, were cracking down on bootlegging operations, threatening to disrupt the flow of revenue and destabilize alliances. Luciano had to ensure that operations continued smoothly, using bribery, blackmail, and political influence to neutralize threats. He understood that control over legal forces was as important as control over guns and men. The hidden war was not merely street level, it was a battle for influence that extended into city hall, union offices, and courtrooms. Competition among gangs was ruthless. The Irish, the Jewish, and the Italian factions all sought dominance over lucrative rackets, gambling, bootlegging, unions, and extortion. Skirmishes could erupt over a single shipment of alcohol or the control of a dockside warehouse. Luciano recognized that direct confrontation was costly and unpredictable. He preferred strategic moves, negotiations, alliances, and covert actions that allowed him to consolidate power without exposing himself to unnecessary danger. Violence was a tool of last resort, deployed with precision to maximize impact and minimize collateral risk. The psychological aspect of the hidden war was just as critical. Fear, uncertainty, and perception were weapons that Luciano wielded expertly. By controlling information, spreading rumors, and signaling alliances, he manipulated rivals into overextending or miscalculating. Men who believed themselves secure could be undermined by carefully placed whispers, strategic acts of intimidation, or subtle shifts in alliances. Luciano understood that a reputation for unpredictability and decisiveness could be more powerful than any army of enforcers. Internal threats were particularly dangerous. Within his own network, ambition and impatience threatened cohesion. Subordinates tested boundaries, sought personal advantage, or underestimated his authority. Luciano maintained discipline not only through fear but through calculated reward. Loyalty was recognized and promoted, betrayal met swift consequences. This internal control created stability within an inherently unstable world, allowing him to project power outward without the chaos of rebellion undermining his plans. The hidden war also involved economics. Control of territory meant control of revenue streams, and revenue streams meant leverage. Luciano meticulously mapped out the value of every neighborhood, dock, and speakeasy. He calculated the profits and losses of every alliance and every conflict. By understanding the financial landscape as precisely as the social and violent one, he could make moves that others overlooked. Money became both shield and sword, enabling him to reward loyalty, punish defiance, and co-opt potential enemies into his network. Political corruption was another battlefield. Luciano's influence extended into the offices of city officials, police commissioners, and union leaders. He understood that a well-placed bribe or a timely favor could avert police raids, secure permits, or manipulate labor disputes to his advantage. By blending legal maneuvering with underground enforcement, he created a multi-layered approach to dominance. Every move in the hidden war was calculated to consolidate power, protect revenue, and neutralize opposition before it could threaten the broader system he was building. Allies were often as dangerous as enemies. Even trusted partners could become liabilities if their ambitions diverged from his own. Luciano constantly monitored his inner circle, testing loyalty through assignments, surveillance, and subtle psychological pressure. The hidden war was as much about controlling minds as controlling streets. A single betrayal could cascade into catastrophe, yet Luciano maintained equilibrium through vigilance, foresight, and an unerring sense of human behavior. The culmination of this hidden war was strategic mastery. By eliminating Masuria and Maranzano, he removed the old guard without plunging the city into further chaos. By creating the commission, he institutionalized power sharing, reducing the need for constant conflict and ensuring stability. His network was no longer a loose coalition of violent men, it was a structured, resilient organization capable of withstanding shocks, absorbing threats, and expanding influence across state lines. The hidden war was not over with the fall of the old bosses. It continued in subtler ways, through territorial negotiations, business rivalries, political maneuvering, and the ever-present threat of law enforcement. But Luciano had shifted the battlefield in his favor. He had transformed chaos into strategy, violence into leverage, and fear into order. His genius lay not just in surviving the war, but in redefining its rules entirely. In the end, the hidden war was less about guns and more about vision. Luciano's ability to perceive the battlefield in its entirety, to understand human psychology, economic incentives, political vulnerabilities, and violent potential, allowed him to operate above the fray. The streets continued to flow with blood, but the structure he imposed ensured that every drop served a purpose, every act of violence was calculated, and every alliance reinforced his growing empire. Through cunning, foresight, and unyielding discipline, Lucky Luciano emerged from the shadows of the hidden war not merely as a survivor, but as the undisputed strategist of America's underworld, setting the stage for an era of organized crime unlike any before. The fall of Lucky Luciano did not arrive as a sudden collapse, but rather as a slow tightening of invisible nooses, a culmination of the very systems he had mastered. Despite his brilliance, even the most carefully constructed empires are vulnerable to exposure, and Luciano had accumulated enemies, legal scrutiny, and internal cracks that threatened to undo decades of planning. The same intelligence and ambition that had elevated him to untouchable status now made him a target. It began with the scrutiny of law enforcement, subtle at first, then increasingly aggressive as the public demanded action against the man who had redefined crime in America. The investigation into Luciano's operations was exhaustive. Federal agents, police detectives, and prosecutors combed through evidence, following the trails of bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and labor manipulation. Informants whispered secrets, former allies feared reprisal and cooperated, and newspapers sensationalized every hint of wrongdoing. The hidden war he had navigated so expertly in the streets became visible in the courtrooms and newspapers. Suddenly, every connection, every alliance, every carefully concealed transaction was vulnerable. The initial blows were psychological as well as operational. Men who had once been loyal began to hedge their bets, concerned that Luciano's growing visibility could endanger themselves. Friends whispered, rivals plotted, and even trusted lieutenants became cautious, testing boundaries and watching for weakness. Luciano's control over human behavior, once near absolute, began to show cracks. Fear and respect could only protect so long, the weight of scrutiny and betrayal pressed against the empire he had built. His arrest was as theatrical as it was inevitable. It was not a battlefield ambush or a violent confrontation, but the careful application of law and surveillance. Agents had mapped his routines, traced shipments, and intercepted communications. On the day of his arrest, Luciano was confronted not by the chaos of street war, but by the silent machinery of justice, an institution he could manipulate in minor ways but could never fully control. For the first time, the man who had orchestrated murder and extortion with impunity faced a power he could not bend entirely to his will. The betrayal was not only legal but personal. Allies who had once served him faithfully offered testimony against him in exchange for leniency. Some feared retaliation from rivals, others sought self-preservation. Luciano understood the dynamics at play, but the sting of being undermined by those he had elevated to positions of trust was personal as well as strategic. The empire, built on loyalty and discipline, was now vulnerable to the very human flaws he had anticipated but could not entirely eliminate. The charges against him were serious and multifaceted: racketeering, conspiracy, and violations tied to his extensive criminal enterprises. The prosecution painted a picture of a man whose reach extended into every aspect of illicit life in New York, a modern-day kingpin controlling both streets and institutions. The public, enthralled by sensational reporting, watched the unraveling of a man whose myth had grown as much as his influence. Yet for Luciano, the myth was a shield as much as a sword. It allowed him to negotiate, manipulate, and, even under pressure, project an aura of invincibility. As the investigation progressed, the psychological pressure mounted. He was isolated from his operations, monitored constantly, and forced to navigate a legal system that demanded transparency he could not afford. Every conversation, every movement, every contact became potential evidence. The streets that had once bent to his will now seemed distant, their loyalty fractured by the threat of exposure. The empire could survive in his absence only if structures held firm, and even then, his influence would inevitably diminish. Rival mobsters and former enemies watched closely. Some sought to exploit the disruption, seizing territories and attempting to capitalize on Luciano's vulnerability. Others remained cautious, aware that he had weathered storms before. Yet, for the first time, the idea that Lucky Luciano could be removed from power was no longer unthinkable. The perception of untouchability began to erode, replaced by a palpable tension as men weighed opportunity against risk. In the background, the political machinery moved with precision. Judges, prosecutors, and politicians, some corrupt, some sincere, leveraged Luciano's exposure to their advantage. The symbiotic relationship he had cultivated with certain city officials was tested, revealing cracks in his protective network. Bribes and influence had their limits when confronted with mounting public pressure and evidence meticulously gathered by determined investigators. The fall also had strategic consequences for the criminal world. Luciano's arrest sent shockwaves through the underworld, destabilizing alliances and creating power vacuums. Families that had operated under his guidance now faced uncertainty, prompting jockeying for position and a brief resurgence of the chaos he had once quelled. It was a reminder that even the most disciplined systems are fragile when the figure at the center is suddenly removed or incapacitated. Yet even as his legal and operational control waned, Luciano's mind remained sharp. He began planning contingencies, anticipating how the pieces of his empire could survive beyond his personal presence. Letters, intermediaries, and coded messages ensured that influence persisted, even if diminished. This was a testament to his foresight. He had built not just an empire, but a network resilient enough to endure shocks. The fall of Luciano was thus both a personal and systemic event. It marked the end of his absolute freedom, the first true challenge to the untouchable myth he had cultivated, and the beginning of a transitional period for organized crime in America. Though he would later continue to wield influence, the arrest underscored the vulnerability inherent even in the most carefully constructed empires. The man who had once commanded loyalty through fear, respect, and strategy now faced a reckoning orchestrated not by rivals, but by law itself, and the very human frailties of those around him. In this period, Lucky Luciano learned a critical lesson: power is never permanent, and even the most brilliant strategist can be ensnared by forces beyond immediate control. The fall was not total, but it was undeniable, a reminder that in the world he had mastered, survival was a constant negotiation, and every advantage carried the seeds of potential undoing. The trial of Lucky Luciano was a spectacle that captured the attention of an entire nation. Newspapers blared headlines of his crimes, painting him as the ultimate embodiment of organized crime, charming, ruthless, and untouchable until now. Courtrooms were packed with spectators, reporters, and law enforcement officials, all eager to witness the man who had built an empire from bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and union manipulation face justice. For Luciano, the courtroom was a new battlefield, one where words, appearances, and calculated behavior mattered as much as guns and loyalty once had. From the very beginning, the trial was fraught with tension. Prosecutors meticulously presented evidence collected over months of surveillance, wiretaps, and testimonies from former associates and informants. Each detail painted a picture of an organized criminal mastermind whose influence permeated every level of the underworld. The public learned of intricate bootlegging networks, gambling operations that spanned multiple states, and the sophisticated financial strategies Luciano had employed to consolidate wealth and control. It was a revelation. A man whose empire had seemed untouchable was now laid bare, vulnerable to the scrutiny of law and media alike. Luciano's defense, however, was equally strategic. His attorneys worked tirelessly to humanize him, portraying him as a businessman ensnared in the chaotic world of Prohibition-era New York. They emphasized his charm, intelligence, and supposed respectability, attempting to contrast the sensationalized media portrayal with a controlled, reasoned image of a man operating within the boundaries of his environment. Luciano himself exuded calmness and confidence, walking into the courtroom with the measured poise of a man who had faced death countless times and survived. Every glance, every gesture, every carefully chosen word reinforced the persona of control, projecting an aura that subtly reminded observers of his enduring influence. The courtroom drama was intense, with testimonies that alternated between shock, admiration, and fear. Former associates revealed the inner workings of his operations, how alliances were built, how rivals were neutralized, and how loyalty was enforced through a combination of reward and threat. Witnesses spoke of bribes to politicians and police officers, illustrating how deeply Luciano's influence had penetrated the legitimate world. Every statement added weight to the prosecution's case, emphasizing that his reach extended far beyond simple street-level crime, into the very institutions that govern society. Yet Luciano remained remarkably composed. He understood the psychology of perception and influence. He knew that jurors, reporters, and spectators were as much players in this drama as anyone on the stand. His calm demeanor, his sharp responses, and occasional displays of charm worked subtly to undermine the fear his reputation might otherwise inspire. He allowed the prosecution to present its narrative, all while planting seeds of doubt about the reliability of informants and the motivations behind testimonies. In essence, he was managing the courtroom as he had managed his empire, through careful observation, manipulation of human behavior, and control of information. The media frenzy surrounding the trial amplified its impact. Newspapers and radio broadcasts sensationalized every development, turning the legal proceedings into a public theater. To the American public, Luciano was a symbol of both fascination and fear, the man who had seemingly defied law and order now caught in its machinery. Public opinion, carefully shaped by sensational reporting and selective disclosures, played a subtle role in the trial. Jurors were not isolated from this influence, and the prosecution leveraged the public's outrage to underscore the perceived danger Luciano represented. The trial also revealed the limits of power and control. Despite his intelligence and strategic acumen, Luciano faced forces beyond manipulation, legal procedures, sworn testimonies, and judicial authority. Unlike the streets, where fear and respect could dictate outcomes, the courtroom operated on rules that required evidence and argumentation. Here, Luciano's empire was abstracted into documents, witnesses, and legal principles, elements he could influence only indirectly. This shift highlighted the vulnerability of even the most disciplined criminal network when confronted with institutional power. Throughout the proceedings, tension mounted over the potential sentence. Convictions on racketeering and conspiracy carried severe penalties, including long prison terms and heavy fines. The prosecution painted Luciano as the architect of a criminal empire that endangered society itself. The defense argued for leniency, emphasizing mitigating factors and the man's supposed contributions to order within the criminal world. Every day of testimony, cross-examination, and legal maneuvering was a high-stakes negotiation, a contest of wits between the man who had mastered the streets and the institutions sworn to hold him accountable. Beyond the legal strategies and evidence, the trial was a psychological battlefield. Jurors, lawyers, and spectators were caught in the tension between fear, fascination, and moral judgment. Luciano's presence, calm and commanding, challenged preconceived notions of criminality. He did not fit the stereotype of a mindless thug, he was articulate, poised, and calculating. This duality complicated the prosecution's narrative and added a layer of intrigue to the proceedings. Observers were forced to reconcile the man's charm and intelligence with the brutality and corruption he orchestrated, a cognitive dissonance that mirrored the contradictions inherent in his empire. The courtroom itself became a microcosm of the larger underworld dynamics. Alliances, betrayals, and strategy played out in legal form. Witnesses navigated fear and incentive, attorneys manipulated perception and argument, and Luciano maneuvered psychologically, maintaining influence even as physical control over his empire diminished. The trial was a continuation of the hidden war he had fought for years, with different rules but similar stakes: reputation, survival, and the capacity to shape outcomes. Ultimately, the trial was both a reckoning and a spectacle, revealing the full scope of Luciano's reach while testing the limits of his control. It demonstrated how the very skills that had made him untouchable, strategic thinking, manipulation of human behavior, and alliance building, could be challenged when confronted by the machinery of law and public scrutiny. Yet even as the verdict loomed, the courtroom confirmed his enduring brilliance. He was not merely a criminal, but a strategist, a master of perception, and a man who could command attention and respect in any arena. Through every day of testimony, cross-examination, and media scrutiny, Luciano maintained a balance of composure and cunning. The trial underscored a harsh truth, that the most powerful empires are vulnerable to exposure, that human alliances are fragile, and that the law, unlike the streets, follows a structure that can threaten even the most meticulous strategist. The trial marked a turning point in his life and in the history of organized crime, illustrating that the untouchable could be brought low, but not without revealing the genius that had made him a legend. Even behind bars, Lucky Luciano's influence did not wane. Prison walls, iron bars, and guards could restrict his physical movement, but they could not contain his mind, his networks, or his ability to manipulate the world outside. From the moment he was incarcerated, Luciano understood that imprisonment was not the end of power, it was merely a different kind of battlefield. The challenge was adapting his strategies to a new environment, one where direct control was limited and influence had to be exerted through intermediaries, coded messages, and psychological maneuvering. Luciano quickly established himself within the prison hierarchy. His reputation as a ruthless, intelligent, and calculating leader preceded him, and both inmates and prison staff recognized that he commanded authority, even without the weapons and money he once wielded openly. Those who sought to challenge him learned quickly that defiance carried social, physical, and psychological consequences. He applied the same principles of omerta he had honed on the streets: loyalty was cultivated, betrayal punished, and influence maintained with a mix of fear and strategic generosity. In this confined ecosystem, social intelligence became as crucial as in the streets. The key to his continued power was communication. Luciano relied on trusted lieutenants outside the prison walls to relay instructions, manage operations, and maintain the flow of money. Letters were written carefully, often coded, ensuring that sensitive information could not be intercepted or misused. Intermediaries became extensions of his will, tasked with implementing strategies he could no longer oversee personally. He treated these communications like boardroom directives, precise and deliberate, blending authority with calculated delegation to preserve the integrity of his empire. Luciano also recognized the importance of maintaining visibility and perception. Prison staff, visitors, and fellow inmates had to see him as a figure of control, not just someone behind bars. He cultivated relationships with guards, using charm, flattery, and subtle intimidation to ensure favorable treatment and access. He positioned himself as both an insider and an untouchable within the prison ecosystem, projecting an aura that reinforced his authority and discouraged challenges from other inmates or minor gang leaders. Strategic alliances remained essential, even in incarceration. Luciano built networks within the prison that extended into political and legal circles outside. He provided protection, advice, and favors to those who could assist him in return. These alliances ensured that he remained a central figure in the underworld hierarchy, his decisions carrying weight despite the physical distance. Men outside the walls deferred to his judgment because they understood the consequences of disobedience, and the benefits of loyalty. One of the most remarkable aspects of Luciano's continued influence was his ability to integrate legitimate actors into his network. Lawyers, businessmen, and even politicians were drawn into his sphere, offering assistance or influence in exchange for favors, information, or loyalty. This allowed him to navigate the legal system more effectively, anticipate law enforcement moves, and even exert subtle pressure on decisions that could affect his empire. Luciano demonstrated that power was not merely a function of physical presence, it was a combination of reputation, intelligence, and strategic alliances. During this period, Luciano also engaged in forward-thinking strategies that would protect his empire long-term. He identified potential successors, grooming lieutenants to manage operations independently while remaining loyal to him. By decentralizing authority, he ensured that no single failure or betrayal could dismantle the organization. This was the same principle that had made his empire resilient outside the prison walls: redundancy, accountability, and strategic oversight. Even in confinement, Luciano applied the lessons of organizational psychology and human behavior that had defined his rise. He was also acutely aware of perception in the public eye. While imprisoned, media attention continued to frame him as a dangerous, influential figure. Luciano used this attention to his advantage, reinforcing his image as untouchable even while incarcerated. Journalists, law enforcement officials, and criminal associates alike perceived him as someone whose reach extended far beyond the confines of prison, and this perception itself became a tool, shaping behavior and decisions around him. Luciano's ability to manipulate events from behind bars demonstrated a unique combination of patience and strategic brilliance. While rivals might have assumed that incarceration meant vulnerability, he turned it into a position of calculated influence. Every decision, every instruction, and every relationship was carefully measured to reinforce the stability of his empire and to ensure that he remained central to the underworld's power structure. In some ways, prison offered an unexpected advantage. Removed from the daily chaos of street operations, Luciano could focus on long-term strategy without the distraction of immediate threats. He could observe his organization objectively, identify weaknesses, and implement adjustments through his lieutenants. He had time to plan, anticipate, and prepare for the eventual transition back into the outside world. The constraints of prison became a crucible in which his strategic mind was sharpened, not dulled. Even small interactions were leveraged to maintain authority. Visiting lawyers, messengers, and prison officials became conduits for influence. Luciano understood the value of information and perception. He cultivated the impression that he was omnipresent, aware of every development, and capable of decisive action despite confinement. This careful management of psychological dominance ensured that challenges to his authority were rare and often short-lived. Luciano's ongoing control also extended to financial operations. He maintained oversight of income streams, ensuring that profits continued to flow and that payments to subordinates and allies remained consistent. This continuity prevented instability, maintained loyalty, and reinforced the perception that he was still very much the center of power. Money, carefully managed, became both incentive and tool for maintaining influence. Above all, Luciano's time in prison underscored a critical truth about his leadership: power was not merely a function of presence or force, but of perception, strategy, and human psychology. Even stripped of mobility and direct access, he could shape decisions, influence behavior, and preserve the integrity of his empire. In the confined world of prison, he was as much a ruler as he had been on the streets, though the battlefield had shifted from territory and violence to intellect, influence, and subtle control. Through careful planning, strategic communication, and psychological mastery, Lucky Luciano demonstrated that true power was not limited by walls or bars. Even in confinement, he remained the central figure of America's underworld, orchestrating operations, influencing decisions, and ensuring that the empire he had built continued to thrive. Prison was not the end, it was a different arena in which his genius for strategy and control was displayed in full. The exile of Lucky Luciano marked the beginning of a new chapter in a life defined by ambition, strategy, and survival. After years of orchestrating an empire that stretched across New York and beyond, the U.S. government made the decision to deport him to Italy, removing him physically from the country he had dominated while attempting to neutralize his influence permanently. On the surface, it seemed like the ultimate defeat: a man whose very name had commanded fear and respect, forced into a foreign land with limited resources, far from the networks he had spent decades building. Yet even in exile, Luciano's mind remained sharp, calculating, and undeterred, and he approached this transition with the same strategic brilliance that had defined his rise. Upon arrival in Italy, Luciano faced immediate challenges. The post-war environment was chaotic, with political instability, economic hardship, and lingering fascist influence shaping the landscape. Unlike New York, where he had cultivated an intricate web of control over politicians, law enforcement, and criminal networks, Italy presented a system in which he initially had little sway. He was a foreigner, an outsider, and a deported criminal, stigmatized and under surveillance. Yet Luciano had long understood that influence was not merely a matter of geography, it was a function of vision, relationships, and perception. In this new environment, he began methodically assessing opportunities and risks. Luciano's early months in Italy were a mixture of observation, networking, and cautious maneuvering. He reached out to old contacts, evaluated the state of Sicilian organized crime, and identified gaps in control that he could exploit. His awareness of human psychology allowed him to read power dynamics quickly, determining who could be allies, who were potential threats, and how best to insert himself into ongoing conflicts without drawing unwanted attention. Even far from the streets he once controlled, Luciano's ability to perceive the mechanisms of influence and authority remained intact. One of the most significant aspects of his exile was the necessity of reinvention. In New York, his name alone opened doors, commanded obedience, and instilled fear. In Italy, he had to establish credibility anew. He approached this challenge with patience, using charm, reputation, and selective displays of power to cultivate both fear and respect among new associates. He reinforced the idea that while he was physically distant from his former empire, his knowledge, strategic acumen, and international connections made him a figure worth heeding. This careful management of perception became central to maintaining influence even in exile. Despite physical distance, Luciano's reach extended back into the United States. He maintained contact with trusted lieutenants, sending instructions and strategic guidance through intermediaries. This allowed him to exert indirect influence over operations, preserving continuity within his empire and ensuring that rival factions could not easily exploit his absence. Through these carefully managed communications, he demonstrated that exile did not equal irrelevance, and that power could be maintained across borders if exercised with foresight and precision. Exile also forced a confrontation with reflection. Removed from the daily operations, constant pressures, and immediate threats of New York, Luciano had space to consider the broader trajectory of his life. He evaluated the decisions that had brought him power, the betrayals that had tested his loyalty networks, and the strategies that had ensured survival. In these contemplations, he also considered mortality, legacy, and the human costs of ambition. For the first time in decades, the architect of organized crime confronted the man behind the myth. Health, age, and the weight of experience shaped this period as well. The relentless pace of crime, warfare, and constant vigilance had left its mark. Luciano understood that his personal influence might wane over time, yet he also recognized that institutions, networks, and systems could outlast individual leaders if properly structured. This realization drove him to focus less on direct command and more on ensuring the continuity of his empire through capable lieutenants, strategic alliances, and the codification of operational rules. In essence, exile provided both limitation and opportunity, limitation in immediate control, opportunity in shaping enduring structures. During this period, Luciano also cultivated relationships with figures in both legitimate and illegitimate spheres. He engaged with businessmen, political actors, and Sicilian Mafia figures, seeking alliances that would expand influence without drawing undue attention. He understood the delicate balance between visibility and discretion. Too much exposure could invite law enforcement scrutiny or political backlash, while too little could allow rivals to consolidate power unchecked. Through careful diplomacy, selective engagement, and psychological insight, Luciano maintained a position of relevance and authority even in exile. Perhaps most importantly, exile forced Luciano to confront his own legacy. He had already transformed organized crime into a structured, quasi-corporate system. The commission, the networks of bootlegging, gambling, and unions, these were his creations, capable of surviving beyond his presence. In Italy, he reflected on the permanence of these institutions and the ways in which his strategies could continue to shape criminal operations across the Atlantic. Exile was a test of the durability of the systems he had built, their continued operation was a testament to his vision and foresight. Luciano's exile also highlighted the tension between myth and reality. To the public, he was untouchable, a criminal legend whose life story captivated journalists and ordinary citizens alike. In Italy, stripped of immediate power but still a figure of awe, he confronted the ways in which perception could magnify influence even when physical control was absent. He became a symbol, both feared and admired, not simply for actions, but for intellect, reputation, and strategic mastery. The legend of Luciano, carefully maintained, continued to exert influence over those who had never seen him in person. In this new phase, Luciano demonstrated adaptability, arguably his greatest strength. Where others might have succumbed to despair or irrelevance, he treated exile as a strategic challenge, an opportunity to observe, plan, and extend influence through indirect means. By cultivating alliances, managing perceptions, and guiding operations from afar, he reinforced the idea that power was not bound to location, that a disciplined mind could shape events even when physically constrained. The endgame of exile was not merely survival but legacy building. Luciano sought to ensure that his vision of organized crime, efficient, structured, and psychologically managed, would endure beyond his personal presence. Every decision, every correspondence, every strategic intervention was calculated to protect the empire, maintain influence, and secure his place in history as the architect of modern organized crime. Even as he lived his final years in Italy, away from the streets and skyscrapers of New York, Lucky Luciano remained a man defined by strategy, foresight, and ambition. Exile had not diminished his intellect or vision, it had merely shifted the arena in which he operated. In reflecting on his life, he understood that power was both temporal and structural, it could be constrained physically, but the systems he had built could persist indefinitely, a testament to a mind that had redefined criminal enterprise for generations to come. Lucky Luciano's legacy is complex, layered, and enduring, stretching far beyond the streets of New York where he first rose to prominence. He was more than a gangster, he was a strategist, a visionary, and a man who understood the intricate interplay of power, fear, loyalty, and perception. The systems he created transformed organized crime from chaotic, street-level gangs into a structured, corporate-like network capable of operating efficiently across cities, states, and even countries. His influence did not end with his death, it set the framework for modern organized crime, establishing principles that would govern the underworld for decades to come. Luciano's most enduring contribution was the creation of the Mafia Commission. Before its establishment, Italian crime families operated largely independently, bound by tradition but often in conflict over territory, influence, and profit. Luciano envisioned a governing council that would mediate disputes, enforce agreements, and coordinate operations across families. By institutionalizing power sharing, he reduced internecine violence and provided a platform for strategic cooperation, transforming the Mafia into a disciplined, quasi-corporate organization. This was revolutionary, it was a system that prioritized efficiency, negotiation, and long-term stability over brute force alone, and it endured well beyond Luciano's personal involvement. Beyond structural innovation, Luciano's genius lay in his psychological approach to leadership. He understood that power was sustained not just through fear but through perception, loyalty, and the careful cultivation of relationships. He balanced intimidation with incentive, creating a network where obedience was rewarded, and betrayal punished swiftly and decisively. This allowed him to manage an empire that spanned multiple ethnic groups, criminal specialties, and geographic territories. By leveraging human behavior as a tool of governance, he demonstrated that leadership in the underworld required intellect, empathy, and strategic foresight, qualities that elevated him above rivals who relied solely on violence. Luciano also modernized the business of crime. He treated illegal enterprises, gambling, bootlegging, unions, and later narcotics, as profit-driven operations. He implemented systems of accountability, oversight, and risk management that mirrored legitimate business practices. This allowed him to maximize efficiency, minimize internal conflict, and protect revenue streams from both law enforcement and rival factions. By professionalizing criminal operations, he set a precedent that would influence organized crime across the globe, illustrating that meticulous organization could amplify power far beyond individual brutality. His impact on criminal psychology cannot be understated. Luciano's methods demonstrated that an empire could be maintained through strategy, influence, and foresight rather than constant displays of violence. He showed that loyalty could be engineered, fear could be leveraged, and perception could be manipulated to maintain control. These lessons transcended his own life, influencing generations of gangsters, criminal strategists, and law enforcement analysts seeking to understand or replicate his methods. In many ways, he codified a philosophy of criminal governance, one in which intellect was as critical as physical force. Luciano's legacy is also measured in the networks he built. Allies such as Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello became conduits of his influence, spreading his principles, methods, and vision across the country and even into international operations. His ability to identify talent, delegate authority, and maintain cohesion allowed his empire to function effectively even during periods of imprisonment or exile. The structures he created were resilient, enduring, and capable of adapting to changing political and economic conditions. This resilience ensured that his influence extended well beyond his lifetime. Culturally, Luciano became a symbol, both feared and mythologized. Movies, books, and later documentaries portrayed him as the archetype of the cunning gangster, ruthless, intelligent, and endlessly strategic. These portrayals, while often sensationalized, captured the essence of his approach to power: calculated, disciplined, and psychologically sophisticated. The myth of Lucky Luciano reinforced his legacy, embedding him into the cultural consciousness as the man who reshaped organized crime, elevated its operations, and blurred the lines between fear, respect, and admiration. Luciano's influence on law enforcement and policy was also profound. His methods forced authorities to evolve, developing new investigative techniques, surveillance strategies, and legal frameworks to combat organized crime. The scale and sophistication of his operations highlighted gaps in traditional policing, prompting innovations that would have lasting effects on criminal justice in the United States. In essence, his brilliance indirectly shaped the very systems that sought to contain him, leaving a dual legacy of criminal ingenuity and institutional adaptation. Even in exile, Luciano's reach continued to shape events. His networks remained operational, his strategic guidance respected, and his name continued to command influence. This enduring power illustrates a fundamental truth about his legacy: it was not tied to physical presence alone but to the structures, relationships, and perceptions he cultivated. Luciano had built an empire capable of outliving him, demonstrating the extraordinary durability of systems designed with intelligence, foresight, and psychological acumen. Ultimately, Luciano's legacy is a study in contrasts. He was a man who embodied brutality and intellect, fear and respect, loyalty and ruthlessness. He reshaped the underworld, leaving behind systems, principles, and networks that continue to influence organized crime today. His life illustrates the profound impact of strategic vision, psychological insight, and meticulous planning, proving that true power is as much about structure and perception as it is about force. Lucky Luciano's story serves as a cautionary tale and a blueprint, a testament to the heights a single individual can reach through intellect, strategy, and understanding of human nature, and a reminder that such influence can reverberate across generations, shaping worlds long after the person has gone. His name remains synonymous with the rise of modern organized crime, a symbol of both the genius and the darkness inherent in the pursuit of power. Lucky Luciano's final years were a study in contrasts: the untouchable crime lord removed from the streets he once ruled, yet still shaping the underworld through influence, foresight, and strategy. Exile and age limited his physical power, but his mind remained sharp, analyzing alliances, managing networks, and ensuring the continuity of the empire he had built. Even from afar, his instructions traveled through trusted intermediaries, maintaining operations, controlling rival factions, and reinforcing loyalty. His life demonstrated that true power relies not just on force but on perception, psychological insight, and structured systems. Luciano's genius lay in creating an empire capable of surviving without his direct presence, balancing fear and respect, and institutionalizing strategies that could endure beyond his own lifespan. By the end, he was both legend and man, a figure whose intellect and strategic mastery ensured his influence persisted, leaving a lasting imprint on organized crime that would endure for generations.